Why does the CIA continue to keep its records relating to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy secret from the American people? Join me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as I examine that question. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy. And I'm going to do a solo performance this week because my colleague and co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel, couldn't make it. And so I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that's the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, you can get a lot more material on this subject at the Future of Freedom Foundation's website. I've published 2 books on this subject, The Kennedy Autopsy, The Kennedy Autopsy 2. We've also published a book by Douglas Horne called JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated. Horne, of course, served on the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s. And in fact, we're coming out with a print version of Doug's book probably by next week. So you'll be able to get that on Amazon. And then we got Jefferson Morley, a former reporter for the Washington Post, has written a book for us called CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files. I've written a couple of other books, Regime Change, The JFK Assassination, The Evil of the National Security State. And then there's a lot more. There's in fact a 7-hour video by Doug Horne that is one of the best presentations of what went on in this assassination, and particularly the autopsy, which is a key to understanding the assassination that you'll ever find. So that's extremely popular viewing on our website. And then I've done a long series myself on the JFK assassination, a video series. What I want to focus on today are the still secret assassination files of the CIA and other government institutions. Now, why are these files still secret? I mean, it's been, more than 55 years since the assassination? Well, the question obviously arises, why were they secret in the first place? Look at the official narrative of what happened here, because everything's very pat in this assassination. Communist Marine, U.S. Marine, who was supposedly a communist, who had supposedly tried to defect to the Soviet Union, and then comes back and essentially everybody leaves him alone at the height of the Cold War, no grand jury subpoena, no indictment, and so forth. That this is just this lone nut, according to the official narrative, who's a U.S. Communist Marine, who decides that he's going to shoot the president. And they say, well, his motive was that he was a little man wanting to be a big man, and he figured he could be a big man by killing a big man. Well, except for the fact that he denied doing it. And not only that, not only did he deny doing it, he claimed that he was being set up. That's what he meant by it when he said, I'm a patsy. I'm being set up here. I'm being framed. So obviously he had somebody or some group of people in mind as to who was framing him, because when he ultimately went to trial, he'd have to say, well, this is who's framing me. Well, why then is everything shrouded in secrecy? It's just a straight, simple murder case, right? And yet, in the Warren Commission, the official commission that was charged with investigating the assassination, they have secret hearings. Now, what is that all about? Well, why not just open it up to the public and show, hey, this was a lone nut, just everything's real pat and everything. There's nothing to hide. Just, let's show everything. But no, everything's shrouded in secrecy. And everything is shrouded in the most important 2-word term in our lifetime, at least in our political lexicon, and that is national security. Now, there's never been a more meaningless term, I think. No one's ever been able to define it. But it essentially gives omnipotent powers to the national security establishment, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA. All they have to do is mention national security, and everybody starts quivering and quaking, and federal judges will, gavel down, case dismissed, national security. And everybody gets all nervous, and, everything revolves around national security, even though nobody can define the term. But it's really an excuse to give the national security establishment omnipotent powers, total powers. That way, the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court, can act like they're just acting legitimately when they defer to the national security establishment and say, oh, well, look, national security just take here. Well, where in the Constitution does it say that, there's some kind of extraordinary national security powers? It doesn't say that. And there's a simple reason for that America wasn't founded as a national security state. America was founded as a limited government republic where you did have full transparency in government operations. But once the conversion took place, which I have long held was the worst mistake the American people ever made, once that conversion took place from a constitutionally limited government republic to a national security state after World War II, that effectively changed everything. That made the national security establishment the most powerful section of the government, one that the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary defers to, that the Congress defers to, and the president defers to. Why? Because it's so powerful. They have the power of assassination. They have the power of spying on people. They have just essentially totalitarian, omnipotent powers that are non-reviewable. Supreme Court won't get involved with any of the exercise of these powers, including the assassination of American citizens, including the assassination of U.S. officials. That as long as the national security establishment relates it to national security, the Supreme Court has said, we can't get involved. It's national security. And so, what did national security have to do with just a regular murder case? See, this is what is one of the real anomalies here, the real mysteries, because they were really intent on keeping things secret. All right, and that's their term today. Now, let me explain to you what happened here. That in I think it was August of 2018, the deadline came up for releasing all the records that had been turned over to the National Archives 25 years previous. Now, I'll go into that background in a minute. But the deadline was up, and the assassination researchers, who are pretty much brilliant people, and what they've uncovered without subpoena power over the last 50 years is absolutely incredible. I mean, that's all the circumstantial evidence, for example, that leads toward the fraudulent autopsy. And as I held in my two books, there's no way to reconcile a fraudulent autopsy with an innocent explanation. I mean, it's just no way. And so they had 25 years to release all their records, and that deadline came due in August, I believe, in 2018. And President Trump was saying, oh, yeah, I'm going to release these records. There's just no reason to keep them secret. And there wasn't any reason. I mean, it's 50 some odd years ago. And yet the CIA goes in there practically at the last minute in President Trump's office and says, look, we need more secrecy, more time for secrecy here. And nobody really knows what they said. Nobody really knows if it was a person-to-person meeting, but there was communications there. And somehow or another, the CIA prevailed on President Trump to extend the time for secrecy. Why? On grounds of national security. Is that ridiculous? You see, the argument was that if the American people got to see these records, 55-year-old records, national security would be threatened. I mean, what does that even mean? That as soon as Americans read these records, like on the internet or something, because darn sure the mainstream press isn't going to cover it, that the United States is going to fall into the ocean, that the communists are going to come and take over America, that Cuba's going to invade the United States. It's ridiculous. And yet the mainstream press just, oh, yes, national security. I mean, they just accept it like, without any question. It's just phenomenal how the mainstream press doesn't question the ridiculous nature of this excuse. Well, so President Trump gives them an extension till, I think it's October of 2021. Okay, now why did they wait till October of 2021 for the next deadline? Well, because that's after the election, after the presidential election. The presidential election is this November. If they had done it in October of this year, you see, then it becomes a campaign issue. And that's the last thing they wanted. They wanted to pass the election, and just pass the election, so that while there may be a spate of publicity at the time, by the time the next election comes around, nobody cares again. Because that's what happened here. In August 2018, there was pretty major publicity. The mainstream press was covering it, that that this deadline was up and the National Archives was saying we're going to release these records, and they had been preparing for this for a year or two, getting all the records ready. And so there was this pretty large publicity. But you see, once the extension's granted, the mainstream press loses interest, and now that the presidential election's on, it's like not an issue. And the same thing will happen as soon as the next election, whether Trump's reelected or Joe Biden's elected, that a year after that, when it comes due, there'll be this little spate of publicity. And inevitably, the CIA will be going to the president and saying, we need another 4-year extension. On national security, you see, they'll be making the same ground. So it seems to me that it's important to talk about it now. Maybe, if we keep talking about it, somebody in the mainstream press will put it to Biden and say, if you're elected, will you grant another extension? And if so, tell us why. We want to know now, before the election. We don't want to know after the election. Or we don't want to wait till after the election to find out what you're going to do. And the same thing with Trump. Are you going to do it again? Are you going to grant another extension? And so that's the reason why this is still so important and why I'm bringing it up in this segment, is that it needs to be talked about. It needs to be asked about. And these candidates should be required to state their positions on what they're going to do when the next extension comes due. Now, let me put things in context as to how this whole thing took place and how it came about with respect to these secret records. As I indicated, when the assassination took place, they immediately shrouded it in words of national security, which, as I indicated, on the face of it, makes no sense. This was just supposedly, according to the official narrative, just a straight murder case. A guy comes out of nowhere, shoots the president, that's it. But they shroud this thing in national security, you see, and this doesn't garner the attention of the mainstream press. It's just so weird that they wouldn't say, what the heck does this have to do with national security? It's just a straight murder case. I mean, you can look at murder cases all across the country. You don't see them shrouded in terms of national security. Well, the fact is that they needed this thing secret. They needed as much secrecy as possible to prevent people from investigating things too carefully. And one of the most important areas where secrecy was absolutely required to maintain control over things was the autopsy. Now, the autopsy, of course, is a procedure that determines the cause of death. And as I've indicated in my 2 books, The Kennedy Autopsy and The Kennedy Autopsy 2, at Parkland Hospital, the medical examiner, Dr. Earl Rose, was required to perform an autopsy by Texas law. This was the law. And he proceeded to start to do that as soon as the president was declared dead. And a team of Secret Service agents said, absolutely not. And there was almost a violent altercation. It was very loud. There were profanities. And Rose was refusing to let them take the body out of the Parkland Hospital. The Secret Service brandished guns, at least by pulling their jackets back and displaying that they're armed and that they were prepared to use them. That was the implicit message. We are prepared to use these guns on any hospital personnel. These were the people who had just been treating the president, and the Secret Service is threatening to kill him for doing their job. I mean, this was Texas law. Texas law says in a murder case, you have to have an autopsy. And Rose is one of the most renowned medical examiners in the country. So they forced their way out of Parkland so that Rose can't perform the autopsy, and they head on over to Love Field, where Lyndon Johnson's waiting for the body. He's already having seats removed from the back of Air Force One. They take the body to Maryland, and they don't turn it over to the medical examiner there in the county in which they landed. They turn it over to the military, to the national security establishment. And then my books go into what happened in the autopsy, but everything was shrouded in secrecy, and the people that were part of the autopsy were sworn to secrecy. I mean, they had to sign secrecy oaths. They were told, you will never ever talk about this. It's classified, and everybody knows what that means. It's in the military, or even just in the federal government. You're told that something's classified, and you got a security clearance. You don't ever talk about it ever, even after you leave. And that's what they told him. You don't ever talk about this, even if you leave the military, or we will come after you. And so everything was shrouded in secrecy. Well, the reason was they were performing a fraudulent autopsy. Well, after the House Select Committee on Assassinations was meeting in the 1970s, which reopened the investigation because so many people said, no, the official narrative makes no sense whatsoever. Enlisted men started coming forward because they had been released from their vows of secrecy and classified information and so forth, and they began telling a remarkable story that they had brought the president's body in more than an hour and a half before the official entry of the body into the morgue at 8 p.m. They brought it in at 6:35 p.m. Well, this is a remarkable story. I mean, you would think somebody in the mainstream press would say, why would they be bringing the body in an hour and a half early, secretly? And are these enlisted men telling the truth? I mean, there's no reason why they would make up the story. And so then when the Assassination Records Review Board starts getting records and documents and so forth in the 1990s, they discover that there's a Marine sergeant named Roger Boyadjian who has a report that he had prepared contemporaneously with the assassination. He had kept a copy of the report that said, yeah, my team carried the president's body in at 6:35 p.m. The official entry of the body was at 8 p.m. That's when everybody thought the body was first being brought in. That's what the official account was. So hey, now you have these enlisted men saying, no, it was actually brought in an hour and a half earlier. Okay, so how does all this happen? And in fact, when Colonel Fink, Pierre Fink, one of the autopsy physicians, was called to testify in the Clay Shaw trial in New Orleans, he was asked about, how he came to be in one of the autopsy physicians, and he says, I received a telephone call from Commander Humes, who was another one of the autopsy physicians, asking me to come over and help, and he told me that they already had x-rays of the president's body. Well, that was at 8 p.m. Fink said he called me at 8 p.m., which was the exact same time that the body was officially first being brought in. Well, how could they have x-rays of the president's head? I mean, that's what Humes told Fink. He says, we already have x-rays of the president's head. How could he have them if the body's being brought in for the first time at that official time? So that was it was a screw-up. But it was an implicit acknowledgement, confirmation of what these enlisted men were saying. So this is where their secrecy really paid off. That there was never a close investigation as to what happened in this autopsy, because by the time people started discovering what happened, it's like the mainstream press has no interest and so forth. Now, what happened was that the assassination happens in 1963. And then it's shrouded in these secrecy oaths and vows of secrecy and threats. And so you proceed up to, I think it was 1991, and Oliver Stone comes out with his movie JFK, which posits that this was a regime change operation. It was a national security state regime change operation based on grounds of national security. No different in principle than the CIA's and the Pentagon's regime change operations in Iran some years before in 1953, and then the regime change operation in Guatemala in 1954, the regime change efforts in Cuba during the early 1960s, including through assassination efforts. You've got the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. After the Kennedy assassination, you have a regime change operation in Chile, where the president was left dead at the end of that operation. And all these were based on grounds of national security, that these were people that were befriending the Soviet Union, and it was necessary to take them out. And then in the Chilean operation, very interesting, because they orchestrated the kidnapping of the commanding general, the overall general of the Chilean armed forces, because he was resisting this regime change operation and said, no, I won't participate with the U.S. in a coup. We have a constitution here. Constitution doesn't provide that type of thing. And U.S. officials' position was, the Constitution doesn't matter if your country's going down. You've got to oust your president when national security is at stake, and when your president becomes a threat to national security because he's befriending the Soviet Union, he's naive, he doesn't understand the threat that communism poses. And of course, this is what Kennedy had done. In Kennedy's speech at American University, he had obviously achieved a breakthrough and realized that the Cold War and all this hostility and close to getting to nuclear war was nonsense, that there could be peaceful coexistence with the communist world. And that's what he announced at American University. And you can see his speech online and read it as well. It was a remarkable speech, but it threw the gauntlet down. That was the war between Kennedy and the National Security State. It was a war over whether the Cold War was going to continue or not, whether America was going to keep moving in this direction. And of course, the National Security Establishment's position was there can be no negotiated in with the communists, that this was a fight to the finish, that you could never trust the communists to arrive at a deal. So Stone posits this, that this was a national security state regime change operation. And of course, the mainstream press went ballistic. Oh no, this is conspiracy theory and so forth. And the CIA, of course, had sent out messages to their assets in the mainstream press saying, look, use conspiracy theory as a way to smear anybody who suggests that this was a regime change operation. And that was a tremendously effective propaganda tool, still is. I mean, there's a lot of people that are scared to death to be called a conspiracy theorist, and therefore they don't want to get involved in the Kennedy assassination. But at the end of Oliver Stone's movie, there's a little blurb there that I forget exactly what it says, but it's something to the effect that the federal agencies are still keeping their records secret. This was 30 years after the assassination. Well, there was national outrage over this. Most Americans, I would venture to say, didn't have any idea. Now, everybody was skeptical. It's always been a majority of Americans that are skeptical of the official story, saying, this is ridiculous. But here you have a little blurb that says they're keeping their records secret, and people were outraged over this. So why the secrecy? Why the need? Well, as we look back on it, the need was so that people wouldn't pierce the things that needed to be pierced, like on the autopsy. And so because of that outrage, Congress was motivated to act. And they enacted the JFK Records Collection Act. And this was during a presidential election. You see, this is where the CIA learned a valuable lesson. Don't have these controversies during presidential elections. Get these deadlines extended till after the election so that they don't become a campaign issue. Because President Clinton, who was running for the first time, said, yeah, let's enact this law. Let's open up these records. And so his opponent, George H.W. Bush, who had been a former director of the CIA, was sort of cornered. And so he signed the thing into law. And it mandated that all of the federal records needed to be released relating to the assassination. Well, as part of this, they call into existence the Assassination Records Review Board. This is the board. This is the staff that Doug Horn served on. And it's the ARRB. Now, Horn's written this magnificent 5-volume book that it's a tough read. I mean, it's like coffee table size, but it's really the authoritative case for me on the assassination. Now, if you've never been exposed to any of the literature on the assassination, I would recommend starting with JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas. Absolutely best introduction to what's going on here. But Horn's book is a watershed. And in fact, my two books, The Kennedy Autopsy and The Kennedy Autopsy 2, are essentially synopses of what Horn did in his remarkable 5-volume work. And so the ARRB is charged with securing the release of all these records. But they release tens of thousands of records, and the ARRB takes some depositions. And one of the most remarkable depositions they took was by a woman named Saundra Spencer, who had served in the U.S. Navy's photography lab in Washington on the weekend of the assassination. And she had a top-secret security clearance. She had worked closely with the White House on photographs, both social photographs, classified photographs. No one's ever questioned the competence or integrity of Saundra Spencer. It would be impossible to find a better witness. And she's called to testify and said that told a remarkable story, just like these enlisted men had told a remarkable story. She said that on the weekend of the assassination, she was brought the official autopsy photographs for President Kennedy's body, and she was asked to develop them. and she developed them, and of course looked them as she was developing them. And well, the ARRB General Counsel, Jeremy Gunn, shows her the official autopsy photographs in the record today, and she closely examines them and says, no. And she's under oath. She says, no, these are not the autopsy photographs that I developed. The ones I developed showed a massive exit-sized wound in the back of the president's head. These photographs show the back of his head to be intact. Well, all right, so right there, you have two separate sets of autopsy photographs. I mean, you got fraud in the evidence. And how do you reconcile fraud on the very weekend of the assassination with an innocent explanation? It's impossible. But you see, they had kept Sandra Spencer's testimony secret for 30 years because she had been sworn to secrecy, classified, okay? And she had kept it secret for 30 years. And so when she's released from her secrecy, she testifies. Now, here's one of the interesting things about the JFK Records Collection Act. This was in 1992. Somebody slipped a provision into the law that said while these documents are going to be released by mandate, the ARRB is prohibited from investigating anything it finds. I mean, is that ridiculous or what? I mean, what if they find something really incriminating, which they did? They couldn't investigate it. And the ARRB Board of Trustees strictly enforced that prohibition on the staff. If any staff member was caught investigating any matter relating to the assassination, he would be fired. I mean, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. I mean, this is a board that's getting, the release of tens of thousands of records, some of which might be incriminating, but they can't investigate it. So, in any event, they were given 25 more years to release some of those records, some of their records. And these are the records that were supposed to be released in 2018. Now, 25 years ago, I'm sure they figured, oh, God, 25 years away, who cares, so far away. Well, it finally came around, though, and they did care. Now, there are still thousands of records here that are still being kept secret. Who knows what else is in these records? But it's widely believed by the researchers, who by and large are a brilliant group of people, that these records, some of them relate to Lee Harvey Oswald, the person who was accused of being the president, the communist Marine, his trip to Mexico City, which has been shrouded in mystery since the very beginning. And it was clearly part of some kind of operation to get Oswald's communist bona fides, because they've got him going to the Soviet embassy, the Cuban embassy, and creating a ruckus and so forth. But after the assassination, they come up with a photograph of Oswald going into, I forget which of the embassies, and it turns out not to be Oswald, somebody else. And then they've got a recording of Oswald calling one of these embassies, and it turns out that it's not the voice of Oswald. It's somebody that's saying he's Oswald, but it's not his voice. And then they somehow or another lose these tapes and these records, some of these records, and say, well, we don't know how we lost them, or the routine destruction, and then it turns out that their surveillance cameras were not working that weekend, or the weekend that week that Oswald was supposedly visiting these embassies. So the whole thing is shrouded in mysteries and anomalies and so forth. But after Oswald was assassinated by Jack Ruby, that part of the investigation is just shut down. I mean, and the Warren Commission doesn't delve into it. It's like, oh well, what difference does it make? Well, it makes a huge amount of difference, because it has all the earmarks of an intelligence operation that went awry, and that as soon as Oswald's assassinated, the attitude is, let's just shut this thing down, let's not go there. And that's the attitude. Keep moving, folks. Nothing here to see. And so it's widely believed by the researchers that these records that they're keeping secret, that multitudes of them deal with the Mexico City side of this operation. And like I say, these researchers are brilliant. I mean, if there's an anomaly, they will find it. And the CIA knows that. And so that's the reason why they want to still keep these records secret, is because they know that the researchers are going to scour them, they're going to go over them, that if something's been changed or altered or something, you can bet your bottom dollar that the researchers are going to figure it out simply by examining other records and so forth. And then there's, of course, always the possibility that somebody will say, hey, there needs to be further investigation here because of these records. So it's clearly, to me, a campaign issue. I mean, why in the world should these records be kept secret, especially given the critical mass of circumstantial evidence pointing to the culpability of the national security state in this assassination? Because, again, it's impossible to reconcile a fraudulent autopsy with an innocent explanation. There's just no way. And I don't know of anyone that's done it. No one has. It's impossible. When you conduct a fraudulent autopsy on the very evening of the assassination, that's built into the assassination itself. So that's my report for this week, is the Libertarian Angle. Hopefully it will cause some kind of discussion where as the ripple goes out and more people start saying, why don't these records be released now? I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't be released before the election. If it were made a campaign issue, Trump could just rescind the order, extend it to October, the secrecy to October of 21, and just say, order the National Archives to release them now. And that's really what he should do. Don't wait till after the election. Let's just do it now. Because, again, after the election, it's going to be that same thing. There'll be a spate of publicity. The president, whether it's Biden or Trump, will grant the CIA's request for another 4 years of secrecy, and we're going to be back to where we were in August of 2018 and where we were 30 years ago. I mean, again, there was no reason for secrecy in the first place under the official narrative. The only reason for the secrecy, as it turned out, was to maintain the secrecy of this regime change operation. So that's my Libertarian Angle for this week, and we'll return next week with my co-host, Richard Ebeling. And thank you all for your great support. We're wrapping up our mid-year fundraising drive. If you haven't donated, we'd greatly appreciate your help. And if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, also to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, and, of course, to this YouTube channel. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.